You don't belong on that bench, you ghetto. Sergeant Mark Reynolds' voice cut through the hushed tension of Courtroom 7A, every syllable soaked in rage and contempt. In an instant, before anyone could fully register the shock, his steel-toed boot whipped upward, slamming into Judge Elaine Parker's midsection with a crack that echoed across the marble chamber. The 64-year-old black judge lurched backward against her high-backed chair, her robes billowing, her hand clutching the bench to steady herself. Gasps rippled like waves. Jurors froze mid-breath. The stenographer's fingers hovered uselessly over her keys. Attorneys stumbled to their feet, and the gallery erupted with startled cries. In that one violent gesture, Reynolds had done more than assault a federal judge. He had detonated the illusion that his power was unassailable. He had revealed his true nature before a room packed with witnesses, cameras, and unknown to him, federal agents waiting for just such a moment. What Reynolds did not realize as his boot landed with brutal force was that he had walked into a carefully laid trap. For months, Judge Parker had been quietly gathering evidence, piece by piece, note by note, clipping together a manila folder that could bring down not just him, but the entire network of officers, supervisors, and officials who had protected him. He thought his kick would silence her, reduce her to another victim of his intimidation. Instead, it was the spark that set fire to everything he had built. 15 minutes earlier, the atmosphere in Courtroom 7A had been heavy but deceptively calm. Morning light streamed through tall, arched windows, spilling golden beams onto the worn wooden benches. The scent of polished oak mixed with the faint tang of dust from centuries-old law books stored in the courthouse archives. For decades, this chamber had witnessed families begging for justice, defendants pleading for mercy, and lawyers arguing until voices cracked. But today, something was different. The air buzzed with an energy that prickled skin and raised goosebumps, like static before lightning. Judge Elaine Parker, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and studied the case file before her for what felt like the 100th time. She had spent 3 sleepless nights circling its contents, reading and rereading the typed accusations, and no matter how many angles she examined, her conclusion was always the same. This case reeked of injustice. The name on the file was Keisha Williams, a 15-year-old black student accused of disorderly conduct and threatening behavior toward a law enforcement officer. At first glance, the charges looked routine, the kind of boilerplate offenses that clogged dockets daily. But Parker had learned long ago that the devil was in the details. Disorderly conduct often meant a teenager talked back. Threatening behavior often meant a child dared to stand their ground. And the officer who had filed this report was none other than Sergeant Mark Reynolds, a name that set alarm bells clanging in her mind. Parker had presided over too many cases with his signature, too many involving black youth, too many where the charges were vague, the language eerily repetitive, the outcomes devastating for families. Keisha sat in the front row that morning, dwarfed by the grandeur of the courtroom. Her navy blue school uniform was crisp, the pleats in her skirt carefully pressed as if perfection might shield her from the storm. Her brown eyes darted nervously toward the bailiffs, then the prosecutor, then the looming bench where Judge Parker studied her file. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white, her entire posture screaming the desperate hope that if she made herself small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, she might survive. Beside her sat her mother, Angela Williams, who wrapped one protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. In her other hand, she clutched a bulging folder filled with report cards, teacher recommendations, church acknowledgments, even a photo of Keisha at her community volunteer event. Evidence, not of a criminal, but of a child excelling despite the odds stacked against her. Angela's lips moved silently as she mouthed a prayer, though her eyes stayed fixed on Judge Parker. She knew what was at stake. She had heard too many stories of young black lives derailed permanently by encounters with officers like Reynolds. She had seen the fear etched in neighbors' faces when they spoke his name. This was not just about Keisha's future. It was about survival itself. The heavy brass hinges of the double doors groaned loudly, drawing all eyes. Sergeant Reynolds entered like a man stepping onto his personal stage. At 6'2" with broad shoulders, his presence filled the doorway. His dark blue uniform was pressed to military perfection. His boots shined until they reflected the fluorescent lights. His belt sagged under the weight of handcuffs, a baton, a service pistol, and pepper spray, each piece of equipment amplifying his aura of dominance. His pale gray eyes swept the courtroom with the cool detachment of a predator surveying prey. When they landed on Keisha, his lips twitched into a smirk that sent a chill down Angela's spine. He looked at her daughter not as a child, but as a target. Then his gaze moved to Judge Parker. His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Not outright defiance, he wasn't reckless enough for that yet, but a flicker of disdain, the kind that said, "You are beneath me. You are temporary. You are an obstacle to be overcome." Parker met his gaze without flinching. She had seen men like Reynolds before, men who mistook their badges for licenses to abuse, who believed their uniforms placed them above scrutiny. But Reynolds was worse. His name had become a drumbeat on her docket, always tied to the same pattern: black teenagers, vague charges, dismissals on technicalities, no accountability. She had been watching, and she had been collecting. The silence thickened as Reynolds made his way to the witness chair. He sat with casual ownership, leaning back slightly, one hand draped lazily over the armrest, the other adjusting his belt as though he were at home rather than under oath. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Everyone could feel it, the swagger, the arrogance, the belief that this courtroom was merely another space where his authority reigned. Judge Parker cleared her throat. Her voice was calm but firm, the practiced tone of a woman who had spent decades commanding respect without raising her volume. "Sergeant Reynolds," she began, "please describe the events that led to Miss Williams's arrest." Reynolds tilted his chin upward, his voice smooth, measured, the cadence of a man who had rehearsed this narrative countless times. "Your Honor, I was conducting routine patrol in the East Side District when I observed a group of juveniles loitering near the Metro bus stop at 5th and Henderson. Given recent reports of drug activity in the area, I deemed it necessary to conduct a community wellness check." Judge Parker's pen scratched across her legal pad. She knew his euphemisms too well. Community wellness check was his code for harassment. Juveniles loitering meant black teenagers waiting for a bus. "And how many juveniles were in this group?" she asked, her tone steady. "5 in total, 4 males, 1 female, all appeared between 14 and 17 years old. Yet only Miss Williams was arrested," Parker noted, her eyes steady on him. "Can you explain why?" Reynolds' confidence flickered. Just for a second, he darted a glance at the prosecutor's table, expecting support, but found only silence. His jaw tightened. "The others dispersed immediately upon my approach." Miss Williams displayed behavior requiring further intervention. Parker raised her eyebrows. "Behavior?" she pressed. "Be specific." Reynolds leaned forward, his voice dropping into the clipped, clinical tone of official police reports. She maintained prolonged eye contact when ordered to disperse. She did not lower her gaze or acknowledge authority. Her posture remained confrontational throughout the encounter. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Angela gripped Keisha's hand tighter. The idea that her daughter could be arrested for looking at an officer was absurd, yet Reynolds' voice carried no irony. He believed it. Judge Parker set down her pen, her eyes fixed on him like twin lasers. "Sergeant, are you testifying under oath that eye contact constitutes disorderly conduct?" Reynolds shifted in his chair. "In my professional experience, prolonged eye contact can signal aggression. We are trained to identify such precursors before escalation occurs." "And in your professional opinion," Parker asked, her voice sharp but even, "what would constitute appropriate behavior from a 15-year-old girl during a police encounter?" The question pierced the silence like a blade. Reynolds stiffened, then answered without hesitation. "Immediate compliance, respectful language, No arguments, no attitude. So questions, Parker continued, about why she was being stopped. Those would be inappropriate? Yes, Reynolds snapped, irritation seeping into his tone. Questions are often disguised arguments. A respectful person follows instructions first, asks questions later. The gallery stirred again. People exchanged looks, whispered under their breath. A philosophy was being laid bare. To Reynolds, compliance was absolute. Curiosity was rebellion. Judge Parker sat back, her face unreadable. But inside her mind raced. She had spent the night before poring over his record. 17 arrests in 18 months, 16 black teenagers, identical charges, identical language. Like a template copy-pasted into report after report. And buried in that stack of files was a name she could never forget, Malik Thompson. Malik had been 16 when Reynolds shot him during what the department called a routine traffic stop gone wrong. The official story was that Malik reached for a weapon, forcing Reynolds to fire. The department cleared him in record time, hailing him as a hero, but something had always gnawed at Parker about that case. And now, watching him squirm under her questions, her suspicions solidified. This man was not just reckless, he was dangerous. She closed Keisha's file with deliberate care, the sound echoing louder than expected in the charged silence. Then she turned to her court administrator, Maria Rodriguez, who had been standing quietly near the side desk. "Ms. Rodriguez," Parker said, her voice level but carrying unmistakable weight. "Please retrieve the Thompson file from my chambers. File marked an investigation." The words landed like thunder. The gallery leaned forward, sensing the shift. Angela Williams's heart skipped a beat. Even the stenographer paused, fingers trembling above her keyboard. Reynolds' face drained of color. His confident posture collapsed slightly, as if gravity had doubled in the room. For the first time that morning, the predator looked cornered. He opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again. His eyes flicked rapidly, calculating, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. The courtroom had become a cage, and for once, he was the one trapped inside. Everyone present, jurors, attorneys, family members, felt the same electricity in the air. Something was about to break. This was no longer just about a 15-year-old girl and an officer's flimsy charge. It was about something darker, something buried, something that smelled of blood and lies. And Judge Parker, standing tall despite the weight of decades in her bones, was about to tear it wide open. Maria Rodriguez's heels clicked briskly against the polished floor as she disappeared through the side door that led to Judge Parker's chambers. The command had been simple, but the atmosphere it created was anything but. Everyone in Courtroom 7A understood the gravity of what was about to happen. For years, the name Malik Thompson had lingered like a ghost in Riverside County, a young black teenager whose life had ended in the beam of Sergeant Mark Reynolds' flashlight and the barrel of his gun. Officially, his death had been filed away as another tragic but justified police encounter. But for those who knew, for those who had whispered in church basements and community meetings, Malik's name was a wound that never healed. And now that wound was being reopened under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Reynolds sat rigid in the witness chair, every muscle in his body taut. The swagger that had carried him into the room minutes earlier had drained from his posture. His pale eyes flicked toward the door Maria had just exited, then darted back to Judge Parker. His lips pressed into a tight line. For the first time, his predator's gaze looked more like prey. The gallery was alive with murmurs. Angela Williams clutched her daughter tighter, whispering a prayer she barely had breath to finish. A young man in the second row muttered, "They finally got him," under his breath, only to be hushed by the bailiff. Everyone was leaning forward, as if their collective anticipation could reach through the walls and drag the file into the room faster. Judge Parker kept her composure, her face calm, though her heart was hammering in her chest. She had waited months for this moment, months of sleepless nights, poring over records, piecing together fragments, following trails that too often ended in dead ends or mysteriously lost files. She had known that if she pressed too hard, the system might bury her along with the evidence. But if she pressed too lightly, Reynolds would continue his reign unchecked. This moment was her gamble, her line in the sand. The door opened again, and Maria Rodriguez reappeared. In her hands was a thick manila folder stamped with faded police seals, its edges frayed from too many hands trying to erase its contents. Balanced on top of the folder was a silver laptop, its screen dark but heavy with possibility. Maria's face was set in grim determination. She walked like a woman carrying dynamite. "Thank you, Miss Rodriguez," Judge Parker said, her voice even but carrying a note of steel. She gestured for Maria to place the folder and laptop on the bench before her. The thump they made echoed through the hushed courtroom. Reynolds shifted in his chair. His fingers twitched against the armrests, fists forming and loosening, the way a fighter does when waiting for a bell to ring. Sweat beaded at his temple despite the cool temperature of the chamber. He leaned forward, his voice tight, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, I don't see how an old, closed case has any relevance here. We're supposed to be addressing the matter of Miss Williams, not dredging up ancient history." Judge Parker fixed him with a look that could carve stone. "Sergeant Reynolds, nothing about the death of a 16-year-old boy is ancient history. And when that death involves allegations of misconduct, it is not irrelevant, it is essential. We are establishing a pattern. Your pattern." The words struck him like blows. A few gasps echoed from the gallery. Parker let the silence linger for a beat before opening the folder. The air seemed to hold its breath as she lifted the first document. "This," she announced, holding up a neatly typed report for all to see, "is the final incident report regarding the death of Malik Thompson, dated March 15th, 2 years ago. According to this document, Sergeant Reynolds, you encountered Mr. Thompson during a routine patrol. The report states he was armed, advanced aggressively toward you, and that you fired in self-defense. That version of events cleared you of wrongdoing and earned you a commendation for heroism under fire. Is that correct?" Reynolds nodded eagerly, sensing a lifeline. "That's exactly correct, Your Honor. It was a textbook defensive shooting." Judge Parker placed the report down. Then, with deliberate care, she lifted another document from the folder. This one bore smudged ink, handwritten notes, and the unmistakable timestamp of an initial submission. She raised it high. "And this," she continued, "is your preliminary incident report, filed electronically at 11:47 p.m., the same night, just 4 hours after the shooting. Would you like me to read your own words, Sergeant?" The color drained from Reynolds's face. His mouth opened, then closed. "Preliminary reports are often incomplete," he stammered in. "Stress of the incident. Adrenaline." Judge Parker began to read aloud, her voice steady, each word cutting through the silence. Subject appeared to be retreating when engagement began. No weapon visible at time of first shot. Subject fell immediately and did not move after impact. Subject was approximately 15 feet away, moving away from officer position. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. A woman in the back row burst into tears. Angela Williams clutched her daughter tighter. Even the prosecutor's pen slipped from his hand, clattering to the desk. Reynolds' face contorted. "Those were just initial observations," he barked, his voice cracking. "The official investigation determined the threat was real. The official investigation was a cover-up." Parker cut in, her tone sharp as broken glass. She tapped the laptop Maria had set before her. "And what we're about to see proves it." Reynolds' entire body went rigid. "Your Honor, that footage was sealed by departmental order. If you show it, you're violating—" "Sealed because it incriminates you," Parker countered. She nodded to Maria. "Please bring up Exhibit C." Maria opened the laptop. The courtroom's large monitor flickered to life, displaying the cold blue glow of a media player. The timestamp at the bottom read March 15th, 9:23 p.m., the screen filled with jerky, low-resolution footage. The sound of heavy breathing and the crunch of boots on gravel came through the speakers. The camera tilted wildly, catching glimpses of a quiet residential street. Porch lights glowed like watchful eyes. Shadows stretched long. Subject spotted on foot, moving between parked vehicles. Reynolds' recorded voice announced, professional and detached. Appears to be juvenile male, approximately 16 to 18 years of age. The lens caught a slim figure darting between cars. The boy's movements were quick but nervous, more like someone trying to get home than someone planning a crime. His clothes were dark, but the logo of a local grocery store was visible on his shirt. "That's Malik," someone whispered from the gallery. The figure turned, his face illuminated briefly by the glow of a street lamp. Young, frightened, clearly unarmed. His empty hands were raised, palms out. His voice cracked as it came through the speakers. "Please don't shoot. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just walking home from my job at the grocery store." Gasps filled the courtroom. On screen, Reynolds' recorded voice responded coldly. Subject displaying suspicious behavior, potential threat indicators, preparing to assess compliance. But the video told another story. Malik backed against a chain-link fence, his hands trembling above his head. Tears streaked his cheeks. His voice broke again. "I don't have any weapons. You can search me. Please, I just want to go home to my little sister." In the present-day courtroom, Reynolds' face was a mask of panic. Sweat poured down his forehead. "Your Honor, you can't take that out of context. There were intelligence reports." "There were no such reports," Parker snapped, holding up another document. "Radio logs show no calls, no suspicions, no intelligence warnings. You fabricated everything." On the screen, Malik's final words rang out. "Please don't hurt me. Tell my mama I love her." Then 3 deafening cracks tore through the speakers. Malik crumpled instantly, collapsing like a marionette whose strings had been cut. The courtroom went deathly still. The footage showed Reynolds approaching the body. His whisper, caught by the sensitive microphone, slithered across the room. "Stupid kid should have known better than to run in this neighborhood." Chaos erupted in the gallery. People cried openly. Some shouted in anger. Others sat in stunned silence. Angela Williams covered Keisha's eyes, her own shoulders shaking with sobs. The bailiffs tensed, ready to control the room, but Judge Parker raised a hand, her calm authority slicing through the chaos. She turned her gaze back to Reynolds, who now looked like a drowning man clawing for air. His hands trembled. His eyes darted wildly. "You don't understand the pressures we face in the field," he shouted desperately. "Split-second decisions, life or death. What we just witnessed," Parker interrupted, her voice icy, "was not a split-second decision. It was the deliberate execution of an unarmed child who begged for his life." Her words hit like thunder. Reynolds' face twisted, his mask of professionalism shattering completely. He leaned forward, his voice rising, spittle flying. "You think you know what it's like out there? You sit in your fancy robe, you protect these criminals, you twist everything into race." The words "you people" burst from his mouth like venom. The gallery recoiled. It was the phrase that revealed his truth, the phrase that had slipped too many times in too many reports. In that moment, the predator had unmasked himself entirely. Judge Parker didn't flinch. She leaned forward, her voice low but cutting through every corner of the chamber. "Sergeant Reynolds, your career has been built on lies. Your arrests, your reports, your commendations, they are the product of racism and brutality. And today, your own words, your own footage, have destroyed you." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Reynolds slumped slightly in his chair, his bravado stripped bare. Around him, the walls of the courthouse no longer looked like allies. They looked like prison bars. The gallery, once an audience he could intimidate, now looked like a jury ready to condemn. Judge Parker closed the folder and set her glasses on the bench. Her voice, calm and steady, carried the weight of decades of truth suppressed. "The court will take a recess," she said. "When we return, this will no longer be about Miss Williams alone. It will be about every child whose life you tried to crush, beginning with Malik Thompson." The gavel cracked like a gunshot. And with that, the room knew nothing would ever be the same. The gavel's echo lingered in Courtroom 7A long after Judge Elaine Parker had struck it. Its crack was sharper than usual, as if the old wood itself understood the gravity of what it had just punctuated. People didn't rush for the exits the way they usually did when a recess was called. They sat rooted to the benches, whispering in hurried tones, their eyes darting between the judge's bench, the trembling figure of Sergeant Mark Reynolds, and the blank monitor that had just finished playing the most damning evidence anyone in Riverside had ever seen. It felt like history itself was pausing to take a breath. Reynolds slumped in the witness chair, the sweat soaking his crisp blue uniform, his jaw clenching and unclenching as he tried to hold on to a shred of composure. The arrogance with which he had entered the courtroom that morning was one, stripped away like paint under acid. What remained was a man cornered, his lies exposed, his bravado collapsing under the weight of his own words. The gallery hummed with electricity. Angela Williams pressed her daughter close, whispering promises that everything would be all right now, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. She had seen men like Reynolds walk away from worse before. She had watched families mourn children, only to be told there would be no trial, no accountability, no justice. But this felt different. For the first time, the mask was slipping, not in private whispers, but in public record. Judge Parker rose slowly, her posture erect despite the exhaustion coiling in her spine. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Reynolds. "When this court reconvenes," she said, her voice ringing clear, "we will hear additional evidence. Evidence that speaks not just to your actions, Sergeant, but to the system that has protected those actions. Court is in recess." The bailiffs moved instantly, escorting her to her chambers as if she were a head of state in hostile territory. Maria Rodriguez gathered the folder and laptop, clutching them as if they were crown jewels. The gallery buzzed louder, conversations breaking out in every corner. Words like cover-up, murder, and FBI floated through the air like sparks on dry grass. Reynolds was left sitting there, flanked by two deputies who looked far less comfortable standing beside him than they had when the day began. He muttered under his breath, his lips curling into curses no one dared record, but everyone could sense. His eyes burned holes into the chamber doors, but underneath the rage was fear, raw, choking fear. Behind closed doors, Judge Parker sat at her desk, Maria setting the evidence carefully in front of her. The judge exhaled deeply, steadying her hands. For months she had carried the weight of these files alone. For months she had wondered if she was paranoid, if she would risking her career on a hunch. But the body cam footage had confirmed everything, and now she knew she wasn't alone. "Judge," Maria said softly, "you know this doesn't stop with him. He wasn't clever enough to cover his tracks by himself. Someone higher up made sure these reports disappeared. Someone signed off on his commendations." Parker nodded, her jaw tightening. Captain Morrison. The name hung heavy in the room. Captain Robert Morrison, commanding officer of the East Side Precinct, a man with a booming voice, a broad smile, and political connections that reached far beyond the county line. In public, he was the face of community policing, shaking hands at fundraisers, speaking at neighborhood watch meetings, preaching about partnerships with the community. But in private, Parker knew he was the architect of a system that rewarded men like Reynolds and buried the children they destroyed. 15 minutes later, the court reconvened. The crowd had grown, word spread quickly through courthouse halls, pulling in attorneys from other cases, clerks from nearby offices, even curious bystanders off the street. By the time the bailiffs called for order, every bench was filled and people lined the walls, their faces tight with anticipation. Reynolds was brought back to the stand, though now the swagger in his walk had evaporated. He looked like a boxer who had been knocked down hard but still had to answer the bell. His uniform clung to him with the dampness of nervous sweat. Judge Parker tapped her gavel once. Court is back in session. We will proceed with additional evidence regarding Sergeant Reynolds' conduct. Maria stepped forward, queuing up another audio file on the laptop. The speakers crackled, and a new voice filled the courtroom. It was Reynolds' voice again, but this time it wasn't official. It was slurred, casual, the kind of voice people use when they think no one is listening. In the background, clinking glasses and muffled laughter set the scene. The problem with policing today, his recorded voice sneered, is we can't do our jobs anymore. Every time we take down one of these punks, some bleeding heart judge cries about excessive force. Laughter followed on the tape. A second voice chimed in, deeper, gravelly. Judge Parker identified it without hesitation. That voice belongs to Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, Sergeant Reynolds' immediate supervisor. Jerry, the audio continued. Hayes laughed. Tell me about it. Remember that Thompson kid? Little thug got what he deserved, but we had to dance around the family's feelings for months. The courtroom erupted in outrage. A man in the gallery shouted, "He was a child!" Bailiffs barked for silence. Judge Parker's gavel came down, restoring order, though her eyes flashed with fury. Reynolds shifted in his chair, his face a mask of panic. Those are private conversations, taken out of context. He barked, but the tape went on. Reynolds' voice, again, colder this time. That boy was asking for it, walking around like he owned the neighborhood, probably slinging drugs. Kids like that need to learn actions have consequences, Hayes replied, his tone disturbingly casual. Maybe if more of them got the message, we'd have fewer problems. The recording ended, leaving a silence that throbbed like a wound. Judge Parker looked directly at Reynolds. So you and your supervisor not only admitted to using excessive force, but also celebrated the death of a 16-year-old boy and discussed using his death as a warning to other children. Tell me, Sergeant, what part of that is out of context? Reynolds' mouth opened, but no words came out. His fists clenched on the armrests, knuckles white. His pale eyes darted wildly, desperate for escape. But there would be no escape. Judge Parker raised another sheet of paper from the folder. This one bore official police department letterhead, its ink stark against the page. This document, obtained from Internal Affairs, shows that Captain Morrison personally signed off on the final report of the Thompson shooting. Furthermore, it reveals that entire paragraphs were removed from the initial draft, including your admission that the subject was retreating. Gasps rippled again. Someone whispered, "He was protected." Another voice answered. They all knew. Judge Parker pressed on. We are no longer dealing with isolated misconduct. We are dealing with systemic corruption, a chain of command that enabled, protected, and rewarded the unlawful actions of officers sworn to protect the public. Reynolds snapped. His composure shattered like glass dropped on marble. He shot to his feet, pointing an accusatory finger at the bench. You don't understand how it works. You think you can sit up there and judge us, but we do the dirty work that keeps the city safe. Without men like me, these streets would be crawling in with gangbangers and thugs. You think these people respect law and order? They only respect fear. The gallery exploded in shouts. Bailiffs surged forward. Angela Williams rose, her voice trembling with rage. My daughter isn't a thug. Malik wasn't a thug. He was a child. Reynolds' face twisted into a snarl. You people never learn. You raise kids who challenge authority, who don't know their place. Judge Parker's gavel slammed down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. That's enough. Her voice cut through the uproar like a blade. Sit down, Sergeant. Reynolds' chest heaved, but he sank back into the chair, his defiance boiling into silence. The room vibrated with the collective realization that they were not witnessing the trial of one man. They were witnessing the exposure of an entire system built on lies. Judge Parker straightened, her eyes burning with clarity. This court will not tolerate bigotry masquerading as law enforcement. We will not ignore the pattern of abuse and cover-up that has cost this community its children. The evidence will show that what happened to Malik Thompson was not an accident. It was policy. As she spoke, the double doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A trio of figures in dark suits entered, their badges flashing as they moved with quiet authority. Federal agents. The room fell into stunned silence. For years, the community had cried for someone, anyone, to listen. And now the highest levels of law enforcement had arrived to see for themselves. Reynolds turned pale. His lips trembled. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't happening. You can't." But the agents kept walking, and everyone in the courtroom understood. This was bigger than Riverside. This was the beginning of something seismic. The silence that fell over Courtroom 7A when the federal agents entered was unlike anything that had come before. It wasn't the stunned hush after a shocking revelation, nor the uneasy quiet of witnesses waiting for their turn. It was heavier, denser, a silence that pressed down on every chest and made each breath feel stolen. It was the silence of a system realizing that its secrets had been dragged into the light and there was no way to shove them back into the shadows. The lead agent stepped forward, her dark suit sharp, her gray-streaked hair pulled tight. She produced credentials with the fluid confidence of someone who had done this before. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but carrying it like a bell in the chamber. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We have warrants for Sergeant Mark Reynolds' arrest on federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The words dropped like hammers. Reynolds' body jerked as if he'd been struck physically. His pale eyes widened, his lips trembled. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, this isn't how it's supposed to go." Two agents flanked him, their hands already reaching for the steel cuffs. Reynolds rose suddenly, his chair screeching against the floor, his chest heaving as if he might fight. But the look on Agent Chen's face froze him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was inevitability. "Mark Reynolds," as she recited evenly, "you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The gallery erupted. Some wept openly, unable to believe they were finally watching the man who had terrorized their community in chains. Others shouted, their voices rising in righteous fury, drowning the bailiff's orders for silence. Angela Williams gripped her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles blanched, tears streaking her cheeks. For the first time in years, she felt a sliver of hope break through the darkness. Reynolds tried to speak, his voice breaking. "This is a setup. You people don't understand. I was keeping this city safe." But no one listened. The cuffs clicked around his wrists, metallic and final. Judge Parker stood tall behind the bench. Her face was pale from the lingering ache of Reynolds' kick, but her eyes were fire. "Sergeant Reynolds," she said, her voice steady, "the only person who destroyed your career was you. Your lies, your arrogance, your crimes. Justice is not your enemy. Justice is your reckoning." Reynolds sagged as the agents pulled him toward the doors. His voice, once sharp and venomous, now cracked like brittle glass. "This is all politics. You're protecting thugs, not citizens. You'll regret this." But the doors closed behind him with a final, echoing thud, swallowing his protests. For a heartbeat, the courtroom held its breath, and then it exhaled in a collective murmur. People hugged, cried, whispered prayers. It felt like the air had shifted, like the building itself had let out a sigh after carrying years of suffocating weight. But Judge Parker knew this was only the beginning. Reynolds was one man, a rotten tree. But she had seen the forest that sheltered him, and she knew how deep the rot went. She straightened her notes and addressed the court. This case will continue. The evidence presented does not stop at one individual. The record will show systemic misconduct, and this court will ensure that truth is revealed. Later that afternoon, while courthouse clerks whispered in hallways and news crews swarmed the steps outside, federal agents fanned out across Riverside County. Black SUVs rolled through quiet suburban streets, lights flashing as neighbors craned their necks. At one address, agents marched up the driveway of a sprawling, ranch-style home where Captain Robert Morrison was eating dinner with his family. His fork clattered against the plate as the knock thundered through the house. When he opened the door, his confident smile froze. Flashing badges met his eyes. His children stared from the table as he was pulled outside in handcuffs. Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it within minutes. At headquarters downtown, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes tried to play a different game. When the agents stormed his office, they found him feeding papers into a shredder, the motor whining as it chewed evidence. His face was red with fury, his hands shaking as he tried to destroy just one more page. But the agents yanked him back, shoving him against the wall as the shredded confetti of corruption floated to the floor. Hayes cursed, spitting venom, his voice breaking as he screamed about loyalty, about brotherhood, about how outsiders didn't understand what it took to police these streets. His words were recorded, every syllable another nail in his coffin. News of the raid swept across the county like wildfire. Phones buzzed in kitchens and barbershops, in school offices and church pews. The same names appeared on every screen: Reynolds, Hayes, Morrison. For years, they had been untouchable. For years, families had whispered their names with fear. Now those names were being spoken on national broadcasts, not as heroes, but as criminals. Back in Courtroom 7A, Judge Parker reconvened to ensure the record was clear. Maria Rodriguez presented stacks of new documents, emails seized from precinct servers, memos signed by Morrison himself. They revealed a pattern too precise to be coincidence. In one email, Hayes had written, "Reynolds' latest incident needs narrative adjustment." Original report says subject was retreating. Suggest revision to emphasize threat indicators. Morrison's reply was chillingly casual. Already handled. IA review scheduled. Media interest low. Family not likely to push. The words drew audible gasps. They weren't the language of law enforcement. They were the language of conspirators, adjusting lies like mechanics fine-tuning an engine. Angela Williams wept quietly in the gallery, her arm around Keisha, who stared at the evidence with wide eyes. For the teenager, the revelation was a collision of two worlds: the classroom lessons about justice and the cold reality that justice had been manipulated all along. The scope of the corruption widened further. Financial records revealed that Reynolds and several others had been receiving under-the-table payments from private security firms and bail bond companies. Bonuses for maintaining low crime statistics in their patrol areas. In reality, this meant either covering up actual crimes or inflating charges against minority youth to meet quotas. Reynolds alone had pocketed over $200,000 in 5 years. Judge Parker read the figures aloud, her voice never wavering. This was not policing. This was profiteering. Human lives were currency. By evening, the courthouse had become a command center. Federal agents moved through its halls with laptops, evidence bags, and encrypted radios. Families of victims gathered outside, some holding photos of their lost children. The steps of the building, once a place where grieving mothers had begged for someone to listen, were now filled with cameras, capturing them finally being heard. Inside a makeshift conference room, Agent Sarah Chen laid out the operation's scope: maps of precincts, lists of names, hard drives lined up like dominoes. Judge Parker stood at the head of the table, her ribs still aching from Reynolds' kick, but her spirit unbroken. "How deep does it go?" she asked. Chen's reply was blunt. "We've identified 12 officers directly implicated, 3 captains, 4 detectives, and we're not stopping there. This isn't just Riverside. We're seeing patterns in neighboring counties. We suspect training materials circulated across state lines." Parker's jaw tightened. She had expected corruption. But this This was an infection, a cancer spreading far beyond her courtroom. That night, the evening news led with the footage from earlier. Reynolds being dragged out in cuffs, Morrison escorted from his home, Hayes shouting as shredded paper rained down across the country. Viewers watched as the story spread, and for the first time, people who had never heard of Riverside spoke Malik Thompson's name. In a small apartment on the east side, Malik's mother, Eleanor, sat before her television. Her hands trembled as she reached to touch the screen, the image of Reynolds in chains reflected in her tear-filled eyes. For 2 years she had fought, begged, screamed for someone to believe her. Tonight, she whispered her son's name into the silence. Malik, baby, they're finally listening. The investigation only deepened. By dawn the next day, raids were underway at 4 precincts. Agents carted out boxes of files, computers, even training manuals that encouraged officers to cite aggressive posturing or failure to comply in nearly every report. The phrases had become legal shields, flexible enough to justify any outcome, lethal enough to excuse any killing. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their microphones thrust toward anyone who would speak. A community activist declared, "This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about a system that taught others to be bad cops. And today that system is cracking." In her chambers, Judge Parker sat with Maria and Agent Chen, reviewing document after document. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. Reynolds had been both a willing participant and a useful pawn. The real architects were the men above him, Morrison, Hayes, and others whose names were only beginning to surface. But even pawns can wreak devastation when given unchecked power. And the evidence showed that for 15 years, Reynolds had done exactly that. Parker leaned back, her eyes burning from hours of review. She thought of Malik's face on the video, of Keisha's trembling hands in her mother's lap. She thought of all the children whose names she might never know, their lives rewritten in reports that turned fear into defiance and innocence into guilt. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, but firm. "We cannot allow this to vanish into bureaucratic silence. We must follow it to the top." Agent Chen nodded. "We will. That's why the Department of Justice is stepping in. This isn't just Riverside anymore. This is federal." As the words settled in the room, Parker realized something profound. This wasn't her fight alone anymore. It never had been. It was a battle for every parent who had buried a child, for every teenager who had been told their very existence was a crime, for every community crushed under the weight of systemic lies. And tonight, for the first time, that battle felt winnable. Outside, the courthouse lights glowed against the night sky. Protesters gathered, their chants rising into the darkness. Some carried candles, others carried signs with names. Malik, Marcus, Destiny, Trevor. Each name a reminder of the cost. Each flame a demand for accountability. And though the road ahead would be long, one truth was undeniable. The wall of silence had cracked, and through those cracks, the truth was flooding in. The courthouse lights still burned late into the night, their glow spilling across the marble steps where families, reporters, and protesters stood shoulder to shoulder. Hours after Sergeant Mark Reynolds had been led away in federal handcuffs, the air around Riverside still thrummed with a restless electricity. People weren't ready to go home. They lingered, talking in urgent tones, holding candles, chanting names into the cool night. Malik Thompson, Destiny Parker, Trevor Williams. Names that had once appeared only in cold police reports now echoed like hymns of remembrance. Inside, Judge Elaine Parker sat at her desk, her chambers transformed into an impromptu war room. Files covered the surface, stacked in neat but endless towers. Federal agents came and went, their radios crackling with updates. Maria Rodriguez sat nearby, typing furiously, cataloging every scrap of evidence. Parker pressed a hand to her ribs where Reynolds' boot had landed earlier that day, the bruise throbbing with each breath. But her mind was sharp, steady. Pain was temporary. The work was eternal. Agent Sarah Chen entered, Her suit jacket loosened, fatigue showing in the set of her shoulders, but not in her eyes. She carried a folder stamped with the unmistakable seal of the Department of Justice. Your honor, she said, placing it on the desk. This is bigger than even we thought. The Attorney General has authorized a federal task force, unlimited resources, full subpoena power. This isn't just Riverside anymore. This is national. The words sank deep. Parker had known for months that Reynolds wasn't an outlier, that Morrison's reach extended beyond one precinct. But to hear it confirmed, to see the Justice Department moving with such force, it was the validation every grieving family had prayed for. The next morning, America woke to headlines that jolted the nation. Riverside cop arrested for murder cover-up. Federal agents raid precinct. Commanders taken into custody. Body cam footage reveals execution of teen. Networks ran the images on repeat. Reynolds' wrists bound in steel. Captain Morrison being escorted out of his house in pajamas. Lieutenant Hayes shouting as shredded paper rained around him. The footage of Malik Thompson's final moments aired on primetime news. The country watched in collective horror as the terrified boy pressed against a chain-link fence. Hands raised, voice breaking. Please don't hurt me. Tell my mama I love her. Viewers across the nation saw what Riverside had always known. This wasn't policing. This was execution. By midday, demonstrations erupted not just in Riverside, but in Los Angeles, Oakland, Chicago, Atlanta, New York. Marches swelled with people holding candles and signs. Mothers carried portraits of lost sons and daughters. Students wore shirts with Malik's name in bold letters. The chant was simple but powerful. Justice for Malik. Justice for all. In Riverside, Judge Parker reconvened her court under heavy security. She wanted the record to be clear. Every word preserved. This court recognizes, she said, her voice ringing out, that systemic corruption has enabled acts of violence against our children. We will not close our eyes. We will not accept silence as justice. The first wave of federal indictments landed like thunder. Reynolds faced 17 counts, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and murder under color of law. Morrison faced 45 years' worth of charges for cover-ups and conspiracy. Hayes faced 30, but the sweep didn't stop there. 12 officers across 3 precincts were charged. Internal affairs investigators were implicated for burying complaints. Even a deputy district attorney was caught in the dragnet for rubber-stamping false reports. The cases moved swiftly, propelled by overwhelming evidence, body cam footage, emails, shredded memos reconstructed by forensic labs, audio recordings, witness testimony. Families who had been ignored for years were finally called to the stand. One by one, mothers spoke of sons labeled thugs, daughters called hostile, children reduced to aggressive posturing in police jargon. Their words were no longer whispers at kitchen tables. They rang out in federal courtrooms where truth could not be buried. Mark Reynolds' trial became the centerpiece. For weeks, America watched as prosecutors laid bare his pattern. 17 arrests of black teenagers in 18 months, all under nearly identical charges. The defense tried to paint him as a dedicated officer in dangerous neighborhoods, forced into split-second decisions. But the video of Malik's killing shredded that argument. No split second could explain a boy with his hands raised, begging for his life. No context could excuse a whisper caught on body cam. Stupid kids should have known better. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Some wept, some cheered, some simply held each other in silent relief. For Eleanor Thompson, sitting in the front row clutching a photo of her son, the words guilty felt like oxygen after years of suffocating silence. At sentencing, the judge's words cut deep. You wore a badge as if it were a license to terrorize. You mistook fear for respect. But today, this court reminds you, no one is above the law. You are sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Reynolds didn't shout this time. He didn't rage. He simply sagged, his shoulders collapsing inward, his pale eyes staring at the floor, the swagger, the sneer, the cruelty, all gone. What remained was a small man swallowed by the enormity of his crimes. Morrison's trial followed. Emails and recordings revealed him as the mastermind, coaching younger officers on how to phrase reports, how to fabricate threat indicators, how to bury complaints. The jury heard him instruct recruits, always mention eye contact, always say failure to comply. Those words protect you every time. His sentence was 45 years in federal prison. Hayes received 30. The dominoes kept falling. Officers once untouchable now stood in orange jumpsuits, their names etched into court records as criminals rather than protectors. But justice didn't end in punishment. It rippled outward, reshaping institutions. The Riverside Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree. New leadership was installed. Training protocols were rewritten from the ground up, emphasizing de-escalation, implicit bias, and community oversight. Body camera footage was now automatically uploaded to independent servers beyond police control. Civilian review boards were granted teeth, their findings binding rather than advisory. Judge Parker declined offers for higher judicial appointments. She stayed where she was, in criminal court, presiding over cases that too often decided the fate of young lives. "The work isn't done here," she told a reporter. "Every child who walks into this courtroom deserves the dignity the system once denied them." Keisha Williams blossomed in the wake of the storm. Once a frightened girl clutching her mother's hand, she became a voice of courage. At 16, she gave speeches at youth conferences, urging her peers to understand their rights and believe in their worth. "I used to think silence kept me safe," she said at one rally. "But silence only protected the people who hurt us. Speaking up is how we protect each other." Her words went viral, shared millions of times across social media. By the time she graduated high school as valedictorian, she had earned a full scholarship to Howard University, determined to study criminal justice and one day return to the courtroom, not as a victim, but as an advocate. Eleanor Thompson became the face of the movement. She established the Malik Thompson Foundation, providing legal aid to families fighting misconduct and scholarships for youth in Malik's name. She tended a memorial garden outside the courthouse, roses blooming in the soil where once she had stood alone, demanding justice. "My son's voice was silenced," she said at the garden's dedication. "But his story will keep speaking for generations." Maria Rodriguez, the court administrator whose steady hands had guarded the files, was appointed director of court security for the county. Her expertise in safeguarding evidence and protecting proceedings became a national model. She traveled to other states, training administrators on how to shield courts from intimidation and corruption. And Judge Elaine Parker? Her name became synonymous with courage. Law schools taught the Crawford, now Reynolds, case as a landmark in judicial integrity. Young attorneys studied her methodical questioning, her refusal to be cowed, her insistence that systemic corruption was as much on trial as any individual. For communities long silenced, she became a symbol of what justice could look like when wielded with both strength and compassion. The ripple spread nationwide. Federal investigations uncovered similar patterns in a dozen other states. Over 300 officers were eventually convicted. Consent decrees reshaped departments across the country, slowly, painfully. Neighborhoods once terrorized by the sight of flashing lights began to rebuild trust. Crime rates in Riverside's east side fell, not because of heavy-handed policing, but because communities and officers worked together. Youth programs flourished. Schools partnered with precincts to build mentorship instead of fear. For the first time in decades, children could walk home without clutching their backpacks like shields. 2 years after the fateful day in Courtroom 7A, a bronze plaque was unveiled outside the Riverside County Courthouse. It bore Malik Thompson's name alongside the words, "Justice delayed is not justice denied, when good people speak truth to power." Judge Parker stood beside Eleanor Thompson and Keisha Williams at the unveiling. Reporters asked how it felt to see Malik memorialized. Eleanor smiled softly. "It doesn't bring my son back, but it means his life mattered. It means the world saw him as I saw him, a boy with a future. Keisha stepped forward, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered with emotion. I'll never forget sitting in this courtroom, thinking no one would have believed her. But Judge Parker believed, and because of that, we believed in ourselves. That's the legacy here. Belief turned into change. And Parker herself, she didn't speak long, just a few words, her voice carrying in the warm afternoon air. The law is not perfect. But when we stand against its corruption, when we refuse to stay silent, it bends toward justice. Today, it bent because of Malik, because of Keisha, because of Eleanor, and because of every parent, every child who dared to demand the truth. This is their legacy. The crowd applauded, but it was more than applause. It was a release, a collective exhale after years of suffocating silence. For the first time in memory, hope outweighed despair on those courthouse steps. Far away, in a federal prison cell, Mark Reynolds sat on a narrow bunk, staring at the cinder block wall. His name, once feared, now mocked. His power, once absolute, now gone. He had wanted to silence a judge with a kick, to show her what real authority looked like. But that kick had been his undoing. Instead of silencing her, it amplified her voice. Instead of breaking her, it broke the system that had shielded him. And for Riverside, for the nation, that was the ultimate justice. Because sometimes the most powerful act isn't striking back. It's refusing to be broken, standing firm, and letting truth echo louder than violence. And so, from the tragedy of Malik Thompson's death came a movement that reshaped a city, shook a nation, and reminded the world of a simple truth. Dignity never goes out of style. If you're watching this, remember what Eleanor did. Remember what Keisha said. Remember how Judge Parker stood her ground. Change begins when one person decides enough is enough. Be that person. Be that change, like share and subscribe so more stories like Malik's can be heard. Because when we refuse silence, truth always wins.